Hi everyone, and welcome to what is another exciting moment for us, and hopefully you. Today Jackie and I are proud to provide you with an overview of what's new and newsworthy in the 2016 In-House Creative Services Industry Report. Like each previous report, this one includes even more data than ever. We did do some trimming of data points that were getting stale or maybe just weren't teaching us enough, but as you can probably guess, we've also added in new topics and questions. As I'm sure you're aware, this report is the culmination of a lot of hard work by three organizations, InSource and the organizations that Jackie and I represent, the Boss Group and Cella. And we'd be remiss if I didn't take a pause to thank you for supporting our organizations, whether you're an InSource member, a client of Cella or the Boss Groups, or simply a respondent to our annual survey. Your support truly means a lot to us. So with that said, let's get to the reason that you're here. Across the next 30 to 45 minutes, we're going to walk you through an overview of the report. We've gone through a redesign this year that we'll hope you'll enjoy. Next, we'll point out the questions that we've added this year, and then we'll hit on some data points that resonated with us and hopefully provide some insight into those data points. We'll close by sharing some of the additional resources our organizations offer to support you and your team, and as time allows, we'll answer some questions. In previous years, the questions have been plentiful, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. If we don't get to your question, we'll try and answer in a follow-up email, so please feel free to post your questions throughout the presentation. As I mentioned, this is the 6th year that we publish a report, and we're incredibly proud that it's become the leading source of benchmarking for the in-house creative community. In fact, it's not uncommon for us to be in an industry event, even one that's not our own, and see our report data reference. We love that. Once again, the results are based on a really strong sample size that cuts across industries, team sizes, funding models, and revenue bands. This allows us to collectively understand where industry standards lie, as well as when or if differences such as industry, team size, funding model, and revenue band matter. As a reminder, the Boss Group, Cella, and InSource are narrowly focused on serving the needs of in-house creative leaders and their teams. Therefore, step one in the survey is to ensure respondents indicate they're from the in-house community. We then ask the respondent to select a title that best describes their role, and this can be difficult as titles and responsibilities vary greatly by organization, but we believe the most qualified information comes from those with in-depth insight into the budget, staffing, technology, and plans of the group, basically those who are in leadership roles. Finally, during our survey analysis stage, we painstakingly sort through response data to eliminate any responses we may feel could be duplicate from the same organization.
So since this is the creative community, let's start with talking about the creative. We have evolved our design, as Connor told us earlier. You can see we've moved away from those suit patterns and taken kind of a sharp right-hand turn into a different direction with our design. In addition, our inside pages have undergone a makeover as well. There's a few things I want to point out to you here. You can imagine one of the reasons we wanted to go through this redesign is we were running into challenges balancing the white space with the growing amount of content, and we were still trying to maintain or maybe even reduce the amount of pages and our printing costs. So here's what those changes manifested as. You can see on the left-hand side, that's where a lot of text is. We've told you some analysis here, some insights, some industry information. That used to be sprinkled at the tops of the white pages across the report. We've now consolidated it down to the divider pages. Next, we've changed our grid. We used to have a right-hand column dedicated to these related resources. Instead, they're now across the footers of the report. One thing I want to point out is year over year, you will see some report, or rather some repeat references here and resources because they are evergreen resources. They're really strong. And each year we do add new ones, so don't ignore these. And then lastly, I want to point out that within our color schematic, when you see the blue, that means there's something really important there we want to draw your attention to, or an insight that we found very interesting. Perspectives from the field is one of my favorite parts of the publication each year. This year we've included 5 articles, all authored by working creative leaders. And I want to take a moment to highlight them because the content again this year is outstanding. And like past years, these articles are really easy to find in the full report because they're on full bleed pages. Let's start with Peter Leeds, from Pitney Bowes, Peter wrote an article about how he went from an in-the-trenches creative to taking on what he thought were appropriate characteristics of a leader and the results that led to. Next, we have an article I'm really quite fond of, written by Carol Carter of BlackRock. Carol manages a global creative services team that once operated as 3 separate organizations. When she asked Cella to come in and review her organization and find opportunities for greater alignment among those 3 locations and also for overall efficiencies, we identified a real need for a creative operations director. Carol agreed and prioritized hiring this role. In this article, she speaks to the benefits her team experienced following the introduction to the role. The next article is written, or rather is on a topic that a lot of teams struggle with. How large should my project management team be? And how can I quantitatively approach the size of my team? Patrice Martirana, who is our leader of ours, who's on site at our Merck Creative Studios team, she wrote this article, and she speaks to how she and her team created a business case for expanding the project management staff. This next article comes from data genius Don McAdang. That's not his official title, of course, but it's how I regard Don, because he really is at the top of our industry in utilizing data visualization technology to communicate team performance. His article speaks to the process he went through to identify a best fit reporting solution for his former team at Charles Schwab. And our last article is by Christine Scheller. This is another one I really love. And Christine talks about how she went from being the first creative ever hired at Franklin Square to getting a seat at the table with the CEO. And the story is a really interesting one, and it involves water bottles. And that's all I'm going to say, because that hopefully will intrigue you to read the story. So each year we add new questions, as Connor mentioned, and we do this based on feedback we hear from each of you and the challenges we see during our Cella consulting engagements and we hear from our training attendees. When there is a lack of industry data to support something, we want to try and provide some direction, and this survey creates a great opportunity to do that. A topic that everyone always wants to hear about, there's always a lot of questions around, is department finances and funding. So to that end, we included a lot of new questions in that space. One of the things that kind of have always surprised me has been how little input creative leaders have into their department budgets. Some creative leaders, you can see here, 15%, create and manage their team budget. And the next 2 bars down, where we see 26 and 23%, they manage the budget and either have significant or limited input into it. But this only adds up to about 60%. And what you can see here is a significant number of creative leaders who aren't involved in the creation of their budget or don't have a lot of insight into it. And that leaves a lot of opportunity for improvement. If you look at that same data point sliced and diced between team size, you can see the story gets a little bit better as teams get larger. Apologize, guys. All right, the next one is marketing-specific procurement partners. Here, what we're doing is asking folks, does your creative group work with an aligned procurement partner who specializes in optimizing your company's creative and marketing spend? We added this in because we really see it as a positive trend that creative teams are being partnered with procurement specialists who understand our world. It's different than buying computers. It's different than buying office supplies. So this is a positive trend for our group. You can see here that 65% of folks don't have that luxury of working with a procurement partner who understands creative and marketing intimately. However, when you look at this by team size, you can see that as the team grows bigger, it is much more likely that the individual in procurement will understand creative and marketing better. And this, to me, my hypothesis around this is that you now represent a larger amount of spend for the company, and there's a more significant focus on your spend. The same data, we wanted to look at how it's split across revenue bands, and it did match our hypothesis in that as the company's revenue increases, so does the likelihood that you're going to be working with a procurement specialist who understands creative and marketing. The next question is one we kind of hear a lot, and coming off those last few really made me want to look at this year. And how does team size and company revenue overlap? The first thing I'll say before I get into the details and showing how it breaks out is the exceptions are huge. So this isn't a one-to-one ratio that if you are a big company, you have a big team. With that, let's give it a go. You can see here across the board, we go from all teams. Small teams is 10 or less. Your mid-sized teams are 11 to 30, and large are 31 or above. The next one over is our NA. These are folks who are in the education, government, or not-for-profit field. And then you can see we go from 1 billion up across some different revenue bands. What I want to point out to you on the far right, where you see greater than 10 billion, 42%, the majority are large teams. But that's not a plurality, right? We see almost 60% of teams are smaller mid-size. The final new question related to department finances is, have you ever been asked to provide a cost comparison between your in-house team and comparable external agencies? So this is the cost savings metric. It's the one that is often talked about at our events. It's a very trendy, but trendy not in it's a fad way, but that it's picking up as becoming a commonplace metric in the in-house industry. If you haven't been asked it yet, I think you should expect to be asked it soon. If you don't know a lot about this metric, you can look at the link at the bottom of this slide, and you'll find two really good resources there. So you can see here, just under half of teams have been asked to provide this information. And not surprisingly, almost 60% of teams in the Fortune 500 have been asked. And the Fortune 500 sometimes is showing us kind of what's coming for the rest of us. So if you are in those red pieces where you haven't been asked yet, recognize that you're probably going to be asked sometime soon.
Another pressing issue within our community is the ability to access talent. And in fact, the Boss Group and Cella just did our Spring Creative Execs Roundtable event on this very topic with somewhere between 60 and 70 in-house leaders. Each year it seems to get more difficult, and this was voiced in these meetings. Whether this is due to technology such as vendor management systems, managed services providers, commonly referred to as MSPs, or rules put in place by procurement or human resources, it is a challenge. One of the challenges we hear most often about is the existence of term limits. This is when organizations enacting maximum length of stay for any contingent worker. Companies do this to reduce the risk of co-employment. What is challenging about term limits, specifically when they're shorter, such as 18 months or less, is that it creates a cycle of consistent turnover and doesn't allow you to take full advantage of all the training time you've invested in a resource. This is especially challenging for creative teams where more and more of the team is comprised of contingent workers. A little more than half of our respondents are still able to do business without the constraints of term limits. That's encouraging. However, unfortunately, almost 2/3 of the Fortune 500 companies represented in our survey have term limits in place. Another challenge of some of the aforementioned access to talent blockers, whether this be intentionally or unintentionally, is that they create a lack of direct communication between staffing agencies and hiring managers. So basically, you guys. I don't have to tell you how difficult this makes finding the right talent on both sides of the equation. It's very difficult to articulate if you don't have direct contact, the look and feel that you're looking in a design or a portfolio, or all the kind of intangibles that you may be looking for that just are very difficult to write out in an automated system without having a direct conversation. And unfortunately, just under half of all creative leaders are able to have direct communication with their staffing agencies. So this puts about half of you in that really unfortunate disadvantage of not being able to articulate yourself directly to your supplier. And while I would have bet that the Fortune 500 this was even more prevalent challenge, it's actually right on par with all teams' response. Social media is still a relatively new thing, believe it or not, and that's hard to kind of, despite the fact that it's hard to remember a time without Facebook and its hashtags. In our experience, social media support is not consistently seated in one area of the business versus another. Largely, this connects to the goals of the social media for each company, or it connects the goals of social media for each company, if indeed those goals are stated. Most often, as you can see here, marketing is the home of social media. And while only 15% of creative teams house the social media discipline, we found that 82% of in-house teams are supporting social media, almost all of which are providing graphic content, while less than a third are providing additional services such as those listed here. You may recall last year we introduced a whole new section about video, given that it's an exploding field for the in-house creative. This year we expanded that section by adding 3 new questions to better understand the scope of our audience of in-house video teams. We found that 60% of teams are providing video services, which is a slight increase over last year. A new question was added: for which audience does your team create the majority of their video work? And we're excited to learn that 70% of the respondents indicated that an external audience is either the majority audience or that their work is split 50-50 between internal and external. So we thought that was pretty exciting. We also learned that how big these video teams are, and as you see here, almost 80% of teams are 3 people or less. This year we dug deeper into relationships with external agencies to learn how in-house teams are partnering with their external partners. As you can see here, it varies widely. Last year we learned that 29% of creative teams partner with off-site production service providers, and this year we wanted to learn how happy these teams were with those partners. The good news is that 73% are either very satisfied or very satisfied. And to that end, we asked what the key benefits and drawbacks are, and we learned the top 3 benefits are additional dedicated resources, more hours of business support, kind of a follow-the-sun approach, specialized skill sets, with the top 3 drawbacks being miscommunication, lack of brand knowledge, and poor attention to detail. And lastly, in regards to new questions, we asked how satisfied users were with our project management systems. Obviously, a lot of time and money goes into adopting one of these tools, so expectations are high. And of course, we expect follow-up questions from this group and our other readers of the report. You'll want to know, how did X tool fare specifically, or Y tool, the tool that you may be using. However, based on the number of responses for each tool, I don't think it's fair for us to report on satisfaction at the tool level when it may only reflect 10 users of that tool, a very small sampling, so we decided not to do that. However, of course, if you want more information or would like to discuss project management tools, feel free to reach out at anyone here at Cella or the Boss Group. We'd be more than happy to do that.
Okay, we made it. Lots of new questions this year, but the old questions, or rather I should say, and the old questions, still give us lots of great insights and data. So what we want to do next is drill into some of that on these questions that we have been reporting year over year. And we're going to start with the one that jumped out to me the most. Those of you who know me won't be surprised where I'm going. I want to talk about chargebacks. And okay, some of you thought I was going to say time tracking, but I'm going to start with chargebacks. Year over year, we saw a 4% increase from 2015 to 2016 on the number of teams that are charging back. It's still just 33% of all teams, or just a third of all teams. So that's not the major change, though. The major change we saw this year that really kind of made me step back was the change in the recovery goals. Take a look on the left-hand side here where you see 59% of teams were subsidized chargebacks, and this year that increased by 10 percentage points. That is a massive increase. My hypothesis on this is that your companies are trying to further incent your internal clients to use you versus external agencies, and to do this, they're just making the hourly cost look artificially lower. So say your cost all in is $110 an hour. They're telling everyone it's $95 an hour because it's still cheaper for the organization to charge your $110 or your $95. I'm starting over, Connor. That sucked. All right, 27 minutes through.
No problem.
Minutes. Yep. I just didn't like it. I didn't like where I was going. I went off script and it wasn't good. Okay. Okay, we made it. Lots of new questions were added this past year, but there are several really great insights and data points we want to point out to you from the questions that we've had year over year from the past 6 years. So let's start with an area that is near and dear to me and really jumped out to me this year. And those of you who know me are probably thinking time tracking, but it's actually chargebacks. We found that the number of teams that are charging back increased slightly. It's a third of all creative teams. It's a 4% increase year over year. But that's not what surprised me. What surprised me was this shift in recovery goals. So you can see that a lot of people switched out from full cost recovery or profit to becoming subsidized. There's a 10 percentage point increase here. My hypothesis on this is that your companies are trying to further incent internal clients to use the in-house creative team versus external vendors. And to do this, they're making the hourly cost of the creative team look artificially lower. The company still only reaps the benefit of the full cost recovery rate, but it can reap a greater amount of that benefit by incenting more clients to use the in-house creative team at a lower rate. Since we saw that the companies are subsidizing chargeback rates more often, we wanted to look at how that was impacting rates. You would expect they were getting lower, and that is what we see. You can see in 2015, 49% of teams were in that mid-range of $81 to $120 per hour, and that has decreased to 38. The interesting thing is a few teams have become more expensive in 2016. More so, though, have become less expensive. The next way we wanted to look at chargeback rates this year was between how it looked in the Fortune 500 and in the full cost recovery teams. And this was based on some work we were doing with these types of teams who were concerned their rates were high. But when we looked at kind of their specific, situations, their rates aren't high. Fortune 500 companies typically have a lot of overhead, which may push their rates to be higher than the general population, as you see on the left. And full cost recovery, they're trying to recover not only their salaries, their benefits, their training costs, their computer costs. They're also trying, or required, not trying, but required to recover utilities and rent and things like that. So it's kind of of course their rate would be higher.
Next, we wanted to look at account services, and our team at Cella are deep believers in account services, almost regardless of your team size. We define account services as having account managers and/or project managers. And as you can see here, as teams grow, there's a much higher likelihood that account services roles will exist on the team. So take a look from small teams left to right. The blue section of our pie chart here gets dramatically lower the larger the team gets. And of course, that makes sense to us. Freelance and temp hiring plans. As you can see here, this is one of the most volatile metrics that we track. What it tells me is in that 2014, when many teams were growing in full-time headcount, your freelancer spending was able to stay mostly flat. Then in 2015, when headcount growth was mostly flat, you were asked to cut your freelancer spending, potentially because there was a belief that your new headcount from the previous year should be taking on this work. However, I think we can all agree that very few in-house teams experience a decline in work year over year, and there's a pretty regular need to supplement your full team. One of the things that Jackie and I were speaking about when looking at this data, we're really excited to see what comes next year, because perhaps 2015 was just an anomaly, but given the data that we have right now, that's our hypothesis. Following last year, you were asked to tighten your spending, and it looks like there's a realization this year that you do need more capacity, just kind of finishing up on that. Also of note, almost half of frontline managers continue to manage too many direct reports, 7 or more. So this isn't good. That's obviously really blocking you from being able to spend quality one-on-one developmental time with your direct reports. It's just too much of a scope of responsibility in terms of direct reports for the survey respondents. Direct department team sizes are most consistently year over year. Department team sizes are mostly consistent year over year. 35% of teams do plan to grow in size, so that's encouraging. 80% of teams average 45 hours or less per week per team member. That's really good news. That's one of the value propositions of in-house versus external agencies. It's that quality of work-life balance while still being able to do great work. And 67% use project management software. That's almost up 20% or 11 points since 2015. So really encouraging there. With that, we want to share some additional resources outside of the report with you, and then we'll respond to a few questions in the remaining time. First, wanted to highlight our partners at InSource. InSource is the original and largest professional organization for in-house creative teams, and they're dedicated to best practices, network, and effective design management strategy. Join InSource on September 29th for another fun and informative evening of insight and networking at the next InSource New York Signature event, In-House Perspectives 2. And have attended these events in the past personally. I can tell you they're a boatload of fun, great networking, awesome speaker, and there's nothing like fall in New York. And then the Boss Group. The Boss Group is a niche provider of human capital solutions, specifically for the creative marketing digital space. Been doing this for over 28 years, and we provide services all the way from temporary, so if you just need an extra pair of hands for a very temporary assignment, up to permalance or temp to hire or direct placements. One of the things that we're very proud of at the Boss Group is our service excellence, and we're actually the only creative staffing provider with multi-geographic reach to be recognized by Innovero in partnership with Career Builder to win Best of Staffing in both the client and talent categories for the past 7 years.
And lastly, Cella. Cella optimizes creative operations for large corporations. So, of course, that means looking at the people, the process, and the technology. And we do this through our end-to-end suite of managed services, consulting, and training. This graphic you see here in the middle of the slide highlights our most popular consulting engagement, our 360 creative degree, or rather, let me say that again, 360 degree creative ops assessment. And during this process, we interview folks in your team, your stakeholders, we look at your technology, your process, etc. And we come back to you with a prioritized roadmap for how to get from where you are today to where you need to be to support your team and your company in the future. With that, we're going to be taking questions, and we want to thank everyone for staying on and enjoying, or rather participating in the webinar at this point.